You are listening to Despair by Michael Brockbank, Episode 22. Tessa and her bodyguard arrived at the manor just before dusk. They had been a bit later than promised to her stepfather, mostly because she wanted to stop and visit the clothier. As they approached the grand double doors to the large building, a thunderous boom erupted overhead. A storm had rolled in rather quickly, but only one of lightning and thunder. The rain didn't seem to want to fall on that particular night. "You're late," Caldwell said, opening the door. It was almost like he was anticipating their arrival. He was a tall, very robust man in every sense. Not only was he carrying far too much weight around his waist, but his arms were the size of tree trunks. Despite being considerably rotund, he was also considerably strong. "Sorry, my lord, the little one," the guard began, "prevented you from doing a simple job. I'm done with you for now," Caldwell interrupted with an angry tone. "It wasn't his fault," Tessa said, keeping her eyes on the ground. She knew that if she looked into his eyes, it would only anger him further. "Go to the parlor and wait for me there," Caldwell said, stepping aside to let the young girl into the manor. Tessa stepped into the foyer of the magnificent homestead. She was privileged in the fact that she lived in such luxury, while many others in town lived in squalor. It was a privilege she would surely shed if it meant getting out from under her stepfather's presence. To the left of her was the parlor, where sat a well-dressed man holding onto some kind of hat while sitting in one of the plush chairs in the room. What appeared to be his coat was draped over the back of its oak frame. Tessa took in a deep breath and let out a sigh. Apparently, her stepfather needed her to help entertain his guest. The man stood as the young girl walked into the room. "Good evening, miss," he said, slightly bowing his head. Tessa knew better than to engage in conversation directly. Her stepfather would have none of it, and she'd learned a long time ago to remain as silent as possible. She forced a smile to her lips and slightly nodded at the man. Her place was in a red velvet chair next to her stepfather's throne, as he would call it. As she sat, the stranger likewise did the same. The sensation she got from him was one of great apprehension and fear. Yet those were often emotions that many people felt while sitting in the parlor. Barnabas Caldwell had that effect on people, especially considering the rumors of his enemies disappearing in the night. After several minutes, Caldwell stepped into the parlor. Both the man and Tessa stood acknowledging his presence. The large man made his way into the lavishly decorated throne and sat down. "Please sit, Frederick," Caldwell said, holding out a hand toward the chair. "Thank you, sir," the man said, taking his seat. "You know why I sent for you?" "I believe so, sir." "Why don't you enlighten me, then?" the burgomaster said, sitting back in his chair with a slight grin. He already knew the answer, but loved to hear people grovel while trying to explain their actions. "It's not my fault, my lord. There was a fire and it ruined the crop," Frederick began. Lifting a hand in the air, Caldwell snapped his fingers, and like clockwork, in walked a thin, aged man carrying a silver platter with 2 glasses of what appeared to be wine. Yaron was an old and frail figure who had been working for her stepfather for as long as Tessa could remember. Each year, it seemed as though the servant aged another 10. As Tessa was quite fond of him, she constantly worried about his health. "How is that my problem? We had a deal, correct?" Caldwell responded as Yaron served both men the glasses of wine. "Yes, sir, but there is literally nothing to offer. Everything was destroyed in the fire." The man took the glass from Yaron and looked down at the red liquid. He was worried that it might have been poisoned. "Where are my manners? Tessa, see to the gentleman's coat. We have much to discuss," Caldwell said with a smile, looking over at Tessa. She already knew what he wanted, as it was the same case every time anyone stepped into the parlor. The young girl stood and walked over to the man to retrieve his coat. Thank you, miss," he said, reaching back and handing her the garb. It didn't take anyone with her gifts to see just how afraid the man was to be sitting in the room with her stepfather. She often felt bad for those Caldwell brought to the manor, and it has made making friends in town exceptionally difficult. But that was the way her stepfather liked it. Gently taking the man's coat, she exited the parlor and walked along the foyer to the back end of the manor to a door. Entering the room, she saw a small table with a lit lantern resting in the center. Next to the table stood a comfortable chair Caldwell gave the young girl to help in her abilities. It was a room she had entered many times before, and was one that she hated. Not because of how small it was, but because of what it represented. Tessa sat at the table and began running her fingers across the fabric of the coat. The young girl already knew what her stepfather wanted based on the brief exchange she heard while sitting in the parlor. When Caldwell asked her to take something from a guest, it was code for her to take the object and use what she heard to inspect the item with her gifts. Reaching out with both hands on the coat, she closed her eyes and focused her mind. In a flash, the man's life began to play in reverse from the moment she took the coat. Tessa watched as he crossed the town from the manor, how he stopped to buy an apple from a vendor on the main road. Even the moment he tripped over a stray dog, which made Tessa giggle for a moment while she concentrated. In her mind, Frederick's life unfolded before her in reverse until the moment he stood at some kind of refinery. He had apparently been talking with someone, but there was no sign of a fire. Focusing intently on the particular instance, she replayed the conversation. "We don't have to give him anything. He didn't collect all this, we did," a smaller man said, looking up at Frederick. "If we don't give him his due," Frederick replied, looking over at several barrels of some kind of powdery substance. Tessa could tell that it was spice, and she had seen it all over town for quite some time. "Just tell him we had a fire. Then we can sell it without cutting the bastard in," the small man said. "And if he finds out?" "He won't. He's big but stupid. Tell you what, give me an hour or so, I'll ship the stuff off and light the damn place on fire. That way, you're technically not lying to the pig." Tessa could see that Frederick didn't want to go along with his companion's plan. While he stood to consider the idea, Tessa kept wanting Frederick to not go along. She knew that her stepfather would want to know what she saw, and explaining the plan would enrage the burgomaster. "Fine, but make sure you get all the barrels out of here before you light it," Frederick finally agreed. Tessa was saddened, for she hated having to be a part in Caldwell's wrath in such a way. Tessa slowly opened her eyes and looked down at the coat. She knew that telling her stepfather what she saw would end the life of the man. Yet, if she didn't tell him and Caldwell found out, it would be her that would suffer his wrath. Again. She sat back in the chair as her eyes welled up with tears. The young girl hated being a pawn in that fashion and wished she didn't have those so-called gifts. They felt more like a curse, especially nights when her stepfather had guests. Looking back at the door, she thought about lying to Caldwell. What if she made up a story to save the man's life? Could she sustain her stepfather's wrath if he found out she lied? "You can't sacrifice yourself. You can't help anyone should he find out," a voice whispered in her mind. "Trust me." It was a voice she had heard all too often. At first, she thought it had been her mother, who was killed in an accident involving a carriage when she was 9. But something inside Tessa told her that it wasn't her mother. The voice only made itself present when the young girl was overly stressed, and that was one of those moments. Taking a deep breath, she stood from the table and walked out of the room. It was time for her to be the bearer of bad news.